Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you all up for our big trip to Norway. This is a great cruise, and I'm very happy to be here with my sister Mimi, and to come back to a place where I've actually spent quite a bit of time, even though I am of a, let's say, as you may tell, an American by accent. I'm a proud mongrel of many nations, but as a sailor, I always feel like I got a bit of the Viking in me, and therefore I've studied some of the Norse heritage, and many years ago I worked for Lindblad Travel and worked on the original Swedish ship, Swedish flagship, the Explorer. Some of you may have heard about. That was the icebreaker, the polar venture that we used to sail out of Gothenburg up the water up to the ice cap and around Greenland and Iceland and all through Scandinavia. So we're going on what I would call the southern resort cruise of Norway, and perhaps some of you will go on further to the far reaches of the great north here. And today I'm going to just give you a kind of a background to this great part of the world. Many of you probably have Scandinavian heritage or have traveled here and know something about it, but the more you come to this part of the world, the more interesting it is. It has, of course, a reputation for its great Viking history. And I titled this actually the Norse Heritage because the word Viking has a limited use in history because it was the time when, of course, the Norsemen were the terror of Northern Europe and the great explorers. I'm going to give another talk just about the exploration and the navigation techniques in a couple of other days. But today I'm going to just show you something about this area of the world where we are traveling. Now, Viking itself was a word that actually means somebody who is in a bay. Vik, as you'll see in many towns in this part of Norway, in Old Norse means a bay. And so a vikingur was someone who would be traveling as a coastal sailor going to the different inlets and fjords of this part of the world. And so that got tagged on to those who were continuing on to on their summer vacations going down to rape and pillage the rest of Europe. So that name still has a sort of a terrifying sound to it, but you don't hear it in modern Scandinavian languages except used in its historical context. So Scandinavians will usually identify themselves first of all by their current nationality, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, or the other parts of Scandinavia, but Viking is the historical term that is used for the area, particularly the Norwegian fjord dwellers that would go on out into this area. Now, old Scandinavia was, of course, right where we are now. Of course, we're leaving from Zealand, which is where modern Copenhagen is, but these are some of the sites of the archaeology and the early Norse settlements, especially up in the parts of Sweden where we'll be, you may have been, the ship will go back to Stockholm and through the great archipelago. Åland is one of the islands off in the Baltic Sea. Gotland, these were some of the earliest of the sites where the fortresses and the armed camps of the early Norsemen were. Like most other early peoples, they were fighting fairly locally over the different land, now Sweden, down into Denmark. Here's the Danevirke, which was the great wall that was built to keep the Germans out of Denmark, and there are still remains of that wall in Denmark that are preserved. Now, of course, we're coming up through what's called the Kattegat, the Catgut, and around up to the Fjordland, up into this vast area of Norway. Then later we'll go back up into the Oslo Fjord. Now, this land was very wild and mysterious to the literate Europeans. And so here's an early description of how these people were coming out of the woods and were half beast and were uncivilized. They did not have writing originally, and they were the barbarians of the north. They came into the southern lands, Germany and then France and the British Isles, as warriors, and they were, like today, somewhat larger and fiercer than the other locals. So this led to that great saying of, in Latin, save us from the wrath of the Norsemen, who came down and pillaged throughout Northern Europe. A lot of this is described in the sagas, which are among the oldest of European literature that was originally transmitted orally and then later written down, especially preserved in Iceland. So the great sagas are the remembrance of the legendary that come down to us today. Traditionally, the Norse lived in earthen houses, and this is a rebuilding of one that's actually in Newfoundland, Omedo, which was the archaeological site that was found in the last century. And they rebuilt the original Norse-style earth houses where a timber frame would be put up, and then they would have large common rooms that would be separated with fireplaces, and then these doorways. But you might notice here, whoops, let me go back. That is a chimney hole, which was called in Old Norse the vind, which means the eye of the wind. And so as the wind would pass, it would draw the smoke out of what was rather smoky quarters. You can imagine living all winter as this would be covered in snow, and you had your fire, and then without a window, you could not take the smoke out of your house. And so in English, that name continues down to us as the opening in a house to let the smoke out. Now here's another longhouse that was reconstructed recently, which gives you an idea of how these people lived for thousands of years. You had the living room, and then the ceremonial meeting hall, dining hall, and then quarters, and the byre, which was where the animals were kept. Now this is not unlike some other peoples around the world who lived in large, common longhouses. There's still some people in the tropics who live this way. But this led to a certain quality of family life in the Old Norse ways, where everybody lived in the same rooms and bundled together. And this has been described by some sociologists as why the Norse families were very, let's say, warm with each other, and particularly they were polygamous and polyandrous, meaning the families would share each other, let's say, generally. So men had a number of wives and women would have a number of husbands, usually within the clan. And so it was written by some of the foreign visitors who came up and were received in the Old Norse land that it was not uncommon for the visiting merchants to be offered the company of the women. And this has been described as part of the liberality of morals in the north versus, let's say, the more religious south, where these things were divided. And this continues as a tradition somewhat to this day. Here is a popular version of Norse culture, which you might have seen, which is if you plan to marry a Viking, be aware his wants will be different. Your wants will be different from what he wants. Now, this is, of course, the punchline is here. You want to buy a house, he wants to buy a boat. Now, Helga and Hagar are famous sort of popularizers of Nordic culture to this day. I was surprised to actually see it still running in the Copenhagen newspapers, where it's somewhat hard to find in some other countries now. But in spite of the Vikings', let's say, ferocious reputation, most of the traveling men were actually traders. And here's a recreation of one of the reenactors of the Viking tradition, where what they were really looking for were trade routes. Now, they often would go pillage when they were not accepted, and they said that they would come, and if they were resisted, they would attack. If not, they would try to establish a trading post. Now, they would have items from the north that were often desirous in the south. First of all, fish, and then metalworks. Sweden and Norway are famous for their metallurgy, and going back into actually ancient times, the copper, tin, and the metalworks, and to this day, the fine metalwork of Scandinavia is one of the base industries of these nations. So here's some medieval descriptions of how they would salt the fish, they would pack the ores and the refined things and take them down on the trading routes throughout Scandinavia and then to the rest of the world. In archaeology, they've found quite a bit of fine artisan goods. These are combs out of a tomb. They also had amber and ivory of walruses and other animals that would be crafted. They also were very good metal workers in copper. So here's a copper cup. The ancient Norse were not ceramic makers like in the other parts of the world. They made metal ware, but that was often ceremonial. Their daily ware was usually carved out of wood. Of course, there's a great deal of wood, so that did not really last in the tombs. But there's quite a bit of archaeology all through this area that have these kind of very fine carvings of metal. Here's the god Thor, who was the guardian of a warrior, and these would be worn as amulets around the neck to guard in the battles of the time. Then they had ever finer jewelry, usually for the women, with filigree, copper, gold, silver, and these have been found in those great funereal boats. Some of this is very symbolic. You can see a man's face here. This is Thor, the guardian god, but this was a clasp for some brooch for some garment at the time. The working on the swords was particularly good. These were often not the battle swords, but the ceremonial swords. You can see the silver and gold filigree here. The fortresses that were common were usually round with stockades and pillars, and then we have the remnants of them in Denmark, through Scotland, parts of England, and of course through the rest of Scandinavia. This is the Fyrkat, which is in North Jutland in Denmark, and it still has, you can see the remains of some of the buildings that were there, though it's just the earthworks that have been preserved. Here is a helmet that was found in Gotland, Sweden, and you can see it was the first example of chain mail. So this was the kind of working of metal that gave armor to the Norsemen that was far superior to many of the people that they were fighting. Another helmet also from Sweden that shows the kind of filigree work that could be made by them. Now, the gods and the cosmology of Norway and Scandinavia was quite elaborate. It was led by this great one-eyed god Odin and his messenger, the raven. He was considered to be the supreme of heaven, and he lorded over the other gods and had his own sayings, which were written down in a book called the Havamal, which has been called the Vikings' Dao De Ching. It was listings of ways to give offerings to the gods, to treat your family, to treat guests, and to prepare yourselves for battle. Now, Odin was then worshipped and protected by the other gods. Here is Thor, which is another war god that was always symbolized with, called the hammer of Thor. I saw some young guys in Copenhagen yesterday who were wearing this hammer on their chest, looking like modern punk Vikings. But Thor is one of the names of also the day. So in English we say Thursday, that is the day of Thor. And Friday is the day of Fritag, which was the goddess of fertility, Fritag. And similarly, the Monday was Mondag, and such. Sunday was the sun day, but Saturday, we use Saturn, as was the Roman god, but in Old Norse, Saturday was called a Lordsdag, which it still is today, and that was the traditional day that you would take a bath, which I do every Thursday still. Saturday, sorry, I forgot. It's Saturdays I take a bath. Well, here are the hammers of Thor. And they were meant to strike the ground, cause earthquakes, and bring down thunder and lightning on the enemies. But when Christianity came to Scandinavia, they were extended, and so then they became the Christian symbol of peace. And in the conversion of Christianity all through Scandinavia, much of the symbolisms of the Norse gods were converted right into Christian symbols. Here's another spirit that you'll see in places, Helga, who was the messenger god between the earth and the different deities. This is a carving on one of the ceremonial funereal carts you can see in Oslo at one of the museums. Here's another version of Thor, who is chaining a great demon. And here's another carving, which is actually Sigurd and Raskil on forging a magic sword on an anvil. And this was one of the sagas that then became part of the tales of the Ring of the Nibelung and also the Lord of the Rings. And so this is a tradition which comes down into contemporary literature, and particularly film and mythology to this day. These kind of fantastic demons, though, were perhaps the terror and the, let's say, the fearful aspects of the ancient mythology. But here's another one that was dug in the northern Norway and near Trondheim, of a chariot carrying the sun. And this has been described as perhaps coming from the trade that went down through Russia down into Persia, because the original vision of the sun as worshipped and be carrying across the sky is linked to Zoroastrianism and the earliest religions of humanity, and that may have been an import from the Middle East to ancient Norway and by the swirling discs of the sun that are a common motif in a lot of the art and textiles and the metalwork and stonework that can be found in ancient Scandinavia. Now, the world was considered to be created by this great serpent called Jormungand, and this was a snake that was always chasing its tail and creating the motion of the planet and the weather, and it was considered to be the spirit of the actual natural life. And it is carved in many forms and seen in many of the filigree artwork of Scandinavia. Here it is in one of the rune stones, one of the grave markers with the elementary Norse alphabet. This was a later development. The earlier Scandinavia had no writing, but it had this kind of very intricate representations of the world serpent and other deities in the finer work that was done. Here's a shield that was found, a ceremonial shield. There were Arab travelers who came up into Russia and then to Scandinavia who described that the chieftains' wives would wear ornamental breastplates like this. So it was not just out of the cartoons, it's actually historical record that these kind of shields and then breastplates were common in the traditional courts of Scandinavia. The world was also represented in this kind of a design called the Yggdrasil, or the world tree. And this is said to be the great ash tree that grows all through life and connects the different parts of the spirit world with the natural world that we know. There were said to be three levels: Asgard, and then the Valhalla, and then Hel. We get the name Hel from the goddess of the underworld called Hel, and then Valhalla was where the warriors would go for their ceremony, and Asgard was kind of the heaven. Heaven is also a Nordic word, but it was all connected by this invisible great branching tree that was constantly growing and then being devoured by animals and by the destruction of the world. And there was a little rat that would run all through the tree to send messages also. This is something you'll see in modern churches and in some modern tapestries and cloth designs through Scandinavia that represents the ancient traditions of Scandinavia. They had ceremonies out in the woods. They built originally no temples. They worshipped spirits of the woods, and they would go out with these great horns. This is about an 8-foot trumpet that was found in one grave, and they would go out and they would have priests and sacrifices in the woods to music. They would then offer lives, either young women or young men, who were said to have been drugged and then happily be sacrificed. One writer who was visiting up in Sweden in the early 800s said that they went to a ceremony where there were over 70 people who were ritually killed and hung in the trees and left there as offerings to the Yggdrasil spirits of the woods. So it was somewhat of a bloody kind of a practice. That man was one of the famous bogmen of Denmark. Here's a site in Scotland, in Balladul, where they have what they call boat graves, where there was a whole series of burials that were done in stone markers that looked like graves. More famously, they actually built boats and then they would burn them out at sea. You may have seen this in some films where the warriors would be cast off and given their trip to Valhalla in a ceremonial burning it in the ocean. Only the highest chiefs would be buried in a boat on land, as has been found. You can see that in the museum in Oslo. Again, a description of a traveler came up and said that there was a chief that died, and there was an immediate halt to all activity, and a great feast was prepared. 1/3 of the estate of the chief was devoted to the funereal feast, and 1/3 was given away to everybody, and 1/3 was left for the family. Now, this was not always true. This was just describing this one chief in this one area. There was variation throughout the Norse land, but one of the curious descriptions was there was a young woman who was chosen to be the messenger of joy for the deceased, and her job was to join the party, have enough drink to get her willing, and then she was given to all the men to enjoy, and then she was placed on the funeral pyre, and one of the elder women would then ritually kill her, and then she would be cremated with the deceased chief. That is not done in Scandinavia today, I assure you. Now, there were not really any written records from the early times, but when there was contact from the north to the south, and particularly Latin was encountered in Greek by some of the travelers, they came back and they developed an elementary alphabet, which is called Furðar in scholarship, but it actually recounts mostly on stones the memorials of various warriors. And this can actually be read to this day. Some people practice fortune telling with rune stones, and you can still a living tradition, but this is where you can pick out and actually describe what these memorials were. Here's again, King Gorm made this monument, member of his wife Thor, Denmark's adornment. So there, in some of the churches that you'll see in Norway and Denmark and places, these stones which have legible memorials. Here's one that says on it, to my two sons, one who went east and one who went west and never returned home. They never came back from battle, probably. Going east meant going to Russia, and going west may have meant going to Greenland, Iceland, or to the Americas. There have been various of these stones found all through Scandinavia, but they're still looking for some in particularly the Americas. Here's one that is said to have been found in a lake in Minnesota and was the subject of much debate over this time because some scholars said it was a forgery, but you may go back and dig in your own backyard and find one yourself if you have a sharp knife. But they're more common. You'll see them standing in the churches. When Christianity came to Scandinavia, these stones were preserved and often then marked with a cross to sanctify them and then continue the Nordic traditions within the Christian faith. The Norse were, of course, great sailors, and I'm going to talk about that more in detail another day as scheduled, but they took their small craft, which were open boats that had these very high bow, a square sail, and they were very good sea boats because they were very beamy and very shallow draft. They probably bounced around quite a bit, but if there was no wind, they could row, and then they had the great advantage, though, of being able to get into inlets, get onto the beaches, go up rivers. They could go anywhere. Larger vessels would be restricted in where they could go. Here's a view of the Pharaoh Islands, which was one of the earliest of the islands that were settled by Norse before they continued on to the Americas and Iceland. You can see here the roots. If you're centered right here in Norway, Iceland isn't so far. Shetland, Faroe, the nearby islands. Then they went, of course, famously down to the British Isles, Ireland, and all the way to the Mediterranean. To the east, they went down the Russian rivers and into the Caspian Seas to Baghdad, and especially to Constantinople. And to the west, they went Greenland, and then it has been proven through archaeology they were in Newfoundland and parts of Canada. It's said they may have even gone down the North American coast as far as Virginia, but they're still looking for evidence of that. The Vikings, they said they would raid in preparation for making a settlement, but they were really looking for and established trade routes. And this is a recreation of the terror of the Norsemen as they came first to this island, historically, Lindisfarne, which is up in the north east coast of England near the Scottish border. And in 793, they attacked and sacked the great monastery on that site, and St. Cuthbert escaped. His monument is actually in Durham Cathedral nearby. But this was the great destruction that began throughout the area as they were resisted. They came more and more, finally conquering the British Isles and then various parts of the northern European continent. The ruins still remain, and here is one of the descriptions of the time. Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we now suffered from a pagan race, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Now, in the medieval times, a lot of the religious communities were put as far away from commerce and population centers as possible, and then they were repositories for reliquaries and jewels and things like that. So they were an easy target for the Norsemen. But the Scandinavians, particularly the Norwegians, had been settling those outer areas even earlier. This is a remains of a fortress from about 6,000 BC, 6,000 years ago, almost 3,000 BC, that has been dug up in the Shetland Islands. So the trade and travel across this part of the sea had been going on far earlier than any historical records. Up in the Shetland Islands, they found this chess set, which was of a later date, probably about 1000 AD, but it shows the kind of delicate carving that was done on walrus ivory and an example of some of the life. Now, this was post-Christianization, because you have a bishop here, and again, chess as a game came from India, so it is of later, let's say, melding of the cultures. Here's some of the pawns who were rather ferocious compared to the pawns we have these days. The Vikings, and being the Norwegians in particular, came around Scotland, then down into the Irish Sea, and they set up different towns through this area. Now, here's a view painted of what is now the city of York in northeast England, and the name actually refers to Eirvik, was the Norse name for that town, meaning the earl or the lord of the bay, and then that became anglicized into York, and so I live in the little fishing village of New York, and very few people know that it's actually a Viking village. But the other Viking village you may have heard of is Blackpool, or in Irish called Dublin, or Dublin. And recently, as they were digging out some infrastructure in the center of the town, they found the Viking remains of the original settlement in the bay, which was a Viking stronghold and trading post that was later conquered by the Irish and then taken back. But that whole history of the Norse invading Ireland and the British Isles was a very long and bloody history, but what it did is it melded all of these people over time, and the Viking era is generally given a reference in history from the first invasion in Lindisfarne in 793 until 1066, when the Normans, William the Conqueror, took England. But of course, the Normans were actually originally Vikings fighting Edward the Confessor's son, who was a Viking from Denmark, and the three-part battle also included an invasion of Harold the Toothless from Norway. So you had essentially Norsemen fighting over the British Isles, and that leads to the modern era of the British Isles being sort of a mixture of many different peoples, of course. Now we're going to be going to Olaf, which is the most northern of the towns we're going, and this is the famous leader from the area who in the 900s gathered his clan and then sailed and then attacked France. And Rollo of Olafsson was the founder of Normandy. Normandy being the land of the Normans or the Norse. They came up the Seine, and this is somewhat of a fanciful picture with the great dragon ships, and they kept trying to take Paris. And they kept attacking the city walls of the Ile de Cité in Paris. They were never successful to conquer Paris, but Charles the Bald, the King of France, or that part at the time, paid them off by giving them the lands in the lower Seine and on the coast, and that became Normandy to this day. And then they became, let's say, Frenchified, if that's the proper description, and the Norsemen who settled in this warm and sunny land called France then became the Normans, who continued their tradition of invading and conquering with William the Conqueror. But Paris was never taken by their attacks. Now on the other side of Europe, though, particularly the Swedes went across the Baltic Sea and then to St. Petersburg now, and then down the rivers, and then the Volga and the Dnieper were settled by these Viking traders. And they were often let's say, red-headed, and so they were called Rus, or the Reds, and that's where you get the name Russia, is from the Scandinavian invaders. So there's a very strong influence through old Russia of the invasions and the trade with Scandinavia and the Norsemen. They continued all the way down to the Black Sea and then to Constantinople, and they attacked Constantinople in the late 800s, and then sued for peace, and then were given a job as what are called the Varangian Guards. The Emperor Theosophists of Constantinople then had Norsemen as his palace guard until later when the Islamic invaders conquered what is now Istanbul. So that's the extent of the Vikings' penetration of the world. That it was known back then, including they were in Italy and Malta, and they sailed their boats all through. But a few went to the west. Now, here's most famously Eric the Red, who was accused of murder, and so he was banished from his home in Norway, and he took his clan and he sailed to Iceland and set up the Icelandic communities that go on to this day. And then his son, Leif Erikson, the son of Eric, then was sent off to find other lands, and he was the discoverer of Greenland, and then he went to what is now Vinland, or parts of North America that have been identified as Newfoundland. Of course, the old story is that Iceland was called Iceland because they didn't want anybody else to come there, because it's actually a very green place. And they say, you should go to the next island, which is Greenland, which is, of course, all ice. And that was one of the earlier, let's say, real estate bubbles that it's still yet to burst. But I'll talk a bit more about that further and how they got there and their navigation techniques. But when they got to the Americas, they came back and orally then written in the sagas that they were fighting the Skrælings, they called them, which were the savages who shrieked and howled, and they called them that name. And here's an illustration of the Norsemen fighting some of the natives in the Americas. But that was a forgotten part of history. More famously was the battles in Europe. Here's a illustration from the Bayeux tapestries of the Norse boats that would cross from Normandy to England and then conquered the British Isles. Now, later there was a lot of battles between different Norse, between the Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians, and they have a long and often bloody history of conquering and oppressing each other, which is now fortunately at an end. There's very competitive feeling among the different Scandinavians, but this king of Norway went and battled in Denmark and was trying to convert Scandinavia to Christianity, and he became Saint Olaf, and he's venerated particularly at the cathedral in Trondheim, and became the great peacemaker among Scandinavians, and felt that this sort of bloody and tribal warfare should not go on, and Christianity then became the religion that was established and spread in his name. Here's a staff that from Sweden in about 1000 AD, which shows the filigree tradition of the Old Norse gods on the top of a clerical staff. Similarly, some of their oldest of their churches, as I said before, they previously had no temples for their religion, but when Christianity came, they started building these fantastic Stave Churches. This one is outside of Bergen. It's almost 1,000 years old. But again, it has these tremendous sort of dragon figures and architecture, which is very distinctive to this area, and sometimes recreated in some modern works, but these became the peacemakers in the time of previous warfare. Another feature of the Norse society is that when they moved away from their traditional lands into new places, they often did not have a nobility or a king who were left back in the old land. But particularly in Iceland, they began what they called the Althing, which was the oldest democratic parliament, which continues to this day. And there's a place outside of Reykjavik where the gathering of the families would send representatives, and then they would discuss and decide various issues, particularly land use and other fishing rights, things like that. And they had what they called the Logsgumandar, which was the law rememberer, who was almost like the judge who said, no, the law says this, that's the way we go. And if they made a new law, this person's job was to remember it. Later it was all written down. But when a German visited Iceland in about 1000 AD, Adam of Bremen wrote saying that the Icelanders have no king, they only know the law. And in one of the Icelandic sagas, this was written that with laws our land will be built, but with lawlessness it will be laid waste. And so you have this great transformation transformation of the Norse culture from being very violent, bloody, and tribal warfare to one of very lawful and also very democratic. And this is a inheritance to this day, where the Nordic countries have a very stable, legal, and harmonious society compared to many other places. Now, if you go to Iceland, you can still go to the place where the original Althing met. Of course, now they meet indoors or at the sauna, but it's a tradition that goes on that is very important. So I've listed some of this heritage that comes to us to this day. I'll just go through it quickly. Hospitalities, certain amount of self-confidence, a combination of individualism and a community responsibility, egalitarianism with self-improvement. Nobody was allowed to lay around in luxury like those Southern Europeans who were often victims of their own affluence, let's say. Then there's this combination of piety and paganism, which perhaps you could say goes on today, idealism and generosity, adventure and exploration, a free trade and entrepreneurial spirit, then the tradition of democracy, human rights. This was still a common law in Scandinavia, what they call almansrek, which is you have the right to walk across any land as long as you keep moving. And that also comes with the right to pick berries and mushrooms, but you cannot stop and settle. And this is quite different than the no trespassing signs that you'll see in the British Isles, for instance. But that goes on to this day. There was also a strong egalitarian tradition for women, and they were often the decision makers or in charge as much as the men, and often the men were away, so they of course ran the roost. And so then I leave peacekeeping because there was enforcement of peace at certain times, and then to this day a tradition of Scandinavia being a leader in now United Nations peacekeeping forces. Another inheritance that we have, at least in English, are all these different words that you may recognize some of them. And so I was picking through an old dictionary of Norse, and I was struck by how many of the words we still use to this day. So I wrote a little skit. If I can press my sister into service here, I'm going to update that cartoon of Hagar and Helga. Why don't you come up, Mimi, and we're going to read you a little domestic saga, which I wrote, not that it's between us, but here, at my son Ole's birth, I'm going to say all these words are Norse, you may recognize them. At my son Ole's birth, her mother gazed at his freckles and waved her wand of a gnarly hand.
Oh, my son's life. Now I'm the mother of an ugly kid, thanks to an ugly man. How wrong!
Ole was scared out of his skin at the sight of his angry mother. I bid my time and waited for his childhood to become a man. And after a while he grew up, and as a good father I gave Ole a knife and fish hooks. And I told him, may this good gear get you out of many a close scrape. But Helga threw a fit of anger.
How dare you spoil him?
What do you mean?
Seems you want to raise a scurvy weakling, needing all that stuff.
Well, it's better that he have skills and stuff than be a toothless, ragged old reindeer like you. Well, we brawled into a boisterous boil. The kid cowered and simpered while the wicker threw out the window. I'm the man of this house. I lay down the law, I said unwisely. It was Sunday, and I had no rights but from Monday to Friday.
Don't try to blackmail me. I'm not your slave.
You should loosen your tight breeches, you witch. And as we scraped about scuffling in our cozy little home, Ole, not to enthrall, crawled across the rug, climbed up and hid under the rafters from all our screeching. But after a while we lay on the floor all tired and pooped out.
Oh, my soul, why do I follow such a shallow, fallow fellow?
Well, I was taken aback by her sorrow. So to make some family calm, I pleaded, don't you trust me? Haven't we lived and thrived on my thrift? But this only egged her on.
We've lived by hook and by crook too long. You should get a job.
Oh, I do have a job. It's putting up with you.
So what? That's not good enough. Or better than a lousy job. Go find a new land.
I already have. I skippered a sail ship to Newfoundland. Though without any wind, we had to row all the way. You should go next time.
You can't get rid of me that easy. I'm through with you. Get out of this house, you oaf. Go to hell.
Hell? If I get away from you, I'll be in heaven. Anyway, thank you. That's it's all Norse to me. Well, anyway, I leave you with one more of the real highlight, Helga. I see Sven and Gretel are getting together again after ironing out their differences. How did that happen? Well, there's the answer. She hit him with her iron. But so this whole Norse and Viking tradition has somewhat become modern mythology, and in recent times, especially so many Scandinavians emigrated to Canada and the U.S., there was a revival of interest in all this old history, romanticized somewhat. Here's at the Columbia Exposition, 1898 in Chicago, one of the first Viking boats that was rebuilt for display, and now you can see them all over the place. Then the mythology came out in many books and movies, and it's become somewhat of a cliche, but in World War II it was used by the Nazis to try to enlist the Scandinavians into their cause. So here's a poster from Denmark that the old Viking spirit should fight those Bolsheviks. Well, you know how that worked out. But there are now recreations of some of the old battles and such. This is actually in the Shetland Islands, called a heli festival, where they all dress up and they have great flaming parades, and I think they have a little bit to drink too at the time. But when we go to Scotland, this is in Stockholm and Oslo, you can actually go out and ride on some of these recreated Viking boats. And then, of course, there's the modern mythology of the Minnesota Vikings. So are those Tampa Bay Vikings? I can't remember what town they're in, but this fellow will greet you wherever you go now. The trolls, and this was, of course, the little leprechauns of the forests. And there's a book, History of Scandinavia, called At War with the Trolls, which is an interesting description of the kind of mythology that leads to modern life in Scandinavia. Not that they're that superstitious, but trolls are everywhere, supposedly. And I put this up for your flagology test. Now, you may know where we're going here. That's the Norwegian flag. We just came from Denmark, Sweden, Finland. But who knows the other Scandinavian nations? Try that one. Is the Åland, which is in the Baltic Sea, which is part of Sweden, but it has its own flag. Then that is Iceland. This is the Faroe Islands, which are independent. And then this is the newest of them, which is the new flag of a newly independent Greenland, and is symbological of the Inuit people, but they took out the cross. But those are the Nordic nations as of today, and they have a Nordic council that includes them all. And of course, it's a fairly cooperative part of the world. So as we're now coming into Norway, you'll see this kind of a scene coming into, this is the entrances to Stavanger, where you have these endless islands, endless channels, and you can appreciate how difficult it must have been to get around this area prior to modern navigation. And as we come into some of the great fjords, here's coming into Flam, the tremendous mountains and scenery that we'll be visiting. Curiously, it's all fairly flat top because the mountains of Scandinavia had all been graded by the Great Ice Age, and what has happened since that retreated, due to that global warming we've been suffering for about 10,000 years, the land actually rose. And so these are curiously rising mountains, and of course a lot of other places are very flat. And I was saying to our Danish friend, why did Norway get all the mountains and Denmark get all the beaches? It's somehow they should share these things a bit more. Another scene, you come into the inner fjord and up to the villages where the rivers came down and the access upland, you get the very old towns of Norway. Here's Stavanger. You'll have the old waterfronts with the fishing and the storehouses that are now mostly converted to shops and apartments. But you have very much of the old maritime life of old Scandinavia is still, of course, very visible in all these towns. Here's one of the local passenger vessels. This is in Stavanger again, which is the new maritime training center. Notice they're practicing on their drop lifeboats that they use on big ships and also on the oil rigs out there in the dangerous Norwegian Sea. Here's a view of Ålesund, which is where we'll be going in a few days. It's a tremendous town, actually, because it's set on these little islands in this great mountainscape, and then it has walkways all along the waterfront. This is the old fishing center. Now, of course, they've had a great crash of the fishing, and now they're more of a residential town, and particularly interesting because of the architecture. They have a lot of Art Deco buildings that they built at the height of their prosperity with the herring trade. Here's one of them with the balconies, and this is considered one of the best examples of early 20th century architecture is in the town of Ålesund. And then we'll be going, first of all, up to Flum, and if you take that railway, you go up to this famous waterfall up at the top of the railway, up on near the tableland below the glaciers where this tremendous waterfalls. And I don't know if you can see, right about there, they ancient maidens dressed in long trellises of hair and with breastplates come out and sing to you. Now, you may only imagine it, but I think I saw it last time I was there. And then you have, of course, the great Fjordland, and there's our ship down below. So this voyage to Scandinavia, Norway in particular, is one of the great experiences in travel in the world. And I hope you can appreciate some of the traditional culture. You still have standing stones. Here in Flum, you still have some ancient Norse graves that are put under a flat stone. And then in Flum in particular, there's a museum of some of the mythology and the folk life of this area, which is represented by a famous Norwegian painter named Bergstrom. And he has some of these images of the mythical past of not too long ago in Norway, in Scandinavia. That's at the bar later in the evening. And in Bergen, for instance, you can go along these old houses that some of them are about 800 years old, that are the old trading houses that have been rebuilt and kept in fairly good shape. They're all leaning on each other, but this is very typical of some of the older towns of Norway that will be going. They are somewhat swamped sometimes by large ships coming in. Fortunately, we will probably avoid most of it, but you'll see that there's a lot of current life, of course. All this old history is there, but you have things like idol shows, and then new Viking women's sports like beach volleyball. This is a new tradition up here. I think it happens on the 3 days it's warm enough to play. So you'll see this whole combination of both the past, the present, and the future as we sail through these beautiful waters. And it's my great pleasure to be with you on this trip, and I look forward to getting to meet you all on our adventure. And to that I say, skål! Thank you very much. Okay.